artistic director of the Australian Chamber Orchestra. He's been in that role for 24 years now, I think, Richard, thereabouts. He's brought with him this beautiful Caritas violin, which I'm going to prevail upon him to play later on today. This is the Caritas, is that right, Richard?
Correct.
That's the one that is worth $10 million. Is that figure correct too, Richard?
I didn't hear what you said.
Okay, good. It's a great pleasure to have him on. Please welcome Richard Tognetti, ladies and gentlemen. Richard's been embarking on a whole lot of different projects, which I want to ask him to tell you about because they're fantastic. They're provocative. He's always collaborating, always trying to do something new, delighting and occasionally enraging his audience. In fact, it sounds like one particular thing, which we'll get to later, nearly had people killed essentially in the audience in Slovenia when he performed it. Recently you put together this project in Slovenia where they've been encouraging you to experiment with things called timeline. Tell me a bit about that and how ambitious it was.
Well, we're so, is this microphone a bit loud? We're so obsessed with the success of pop music and the vertical timeline, you know, the top of the Billboard charts. I thought, well, maybe it's worth, and often classical music is you know, made to look so irrelevant that you wonder why we even bother. And so I thought, well, maybe it's worth looking at the horizontal line and what matters, you know, in a sort of Darwinian evolutionary way, go right from the very beginning. And of course, here in this land of ours, we have some of the oldest music, if not the oldest extant music, being the indigenous music, or music of the indigenous population. And it's somewhere between 40 to 60,000 years old, which is astonishing. Before that, we had the Big Bang, which creates the sound and the visuals that you get in the TV, white noise. That's left over, the remnants of the Big Bang, which is in effect music and has inspired some people to write things. So we actually can start with that. And then there are lots of gaps. Unfortunately, the ancient Greeks, unfortunately, Plato and co didn't write down music. So we can only but imagine. And then we only have half an hour, and I'm only at the beginning. But look, then we go through. And so in effect, what we're doing is creating the most ambitious musical medley ever put together.
So it's a timeline of all of music that we know
Everything
of,
that
from
we
the
know.
beginning to where we are now.
Yeah, and so I thought, well, what would be good, and of course a lot of it is you know, about the Western canon. There's music from all sorts of cultures, don't get me wrong, but it's what has sort of made it into the canon. So there's a political element to this, and of course many people are going to be aghast at what is missing. But on the timeline, we are limited by time. And then once we get into the 20th century, it's quite amazing how the baton is just hurled over the Atlantic from Europe and is caught by musicians running as fast as they can on the American continent. And it's amazing. And it's pretty much, I don't know why, but the change of centuries is a change of music.
What effect does that have on the audience, trying to see the entirety of music as we can gather it?
It's a bit like having your life just flashing between your ears. And then as we get into the 20th century, I think what it does to the listener is make you very proud that you're alive and able to experience this astonishing era and or epoch. And what happens is that things get faster and faster and faster. And so I've set as a goal that we will have the most current pop music played without prejudice, because this is what's going on at the moment in the vertical timeline.
You're a very accomplished violinist. Before Christmas, speaking about one of Malcolm Gladwell's theories, another one of his is his outliers theory of 10,000 hours of practice is the key to mastery, whether that's Bill Gates or the Beatles or whatever. What do you think of that theory? Do you think that's it, or do you think there's more to it than that?
No, I think there's more to it than that. I think it's 20,000. You know, I mean, it's a bit like learning Mandarin, I'd say. You know, or any language. It's rare to find somebody who's speaking a second language after the age of 12 without accent. And so it is with a stringed instrument. It's rare to find somebody who starts over the age of 6 and is a professional violinist. You can pick up the horn because you have to have this natural embouchure. You can sing because your voice is there, but there's something about playing a stringed instrument with the micromuscular movements.
So it's too late for me then. That's what you're telling me. And I'll never play for the Sydney Swans either, will I? I have to get used to that idea, I suppose. It's heartbreaking to hear this, Richard.
Well, we need good listeners.
We do that. Thank you for that. That's very kind. You've brought this beautiful violin with you. This was made, what, in the 1700s, thereabouts, wasn't it?
In 1743.
1743, exactly, in a town in Italy called Cremona.
And the year that Thomas Jefferson, the third president of the US, was born. And I say that because he was also a violinist.
He was indeed. We've, in the hundreds of years that have passed since then, can we now use technology to study this very, very closely and produce its perfect replica?
If only. And then we wouldn't have to pay millions of dollars to purchase these instruments. I mean, I argue that actually for the price, they're cheap. Considering you can buy, easily millions of dollars will buy you a not even grand palace, in Sydney real estate. But for some reason we focus on this because it's only a violin. I would argue that there are only about 50 of these in the world. And
so its brilliance is not, you can't replicate that brilliance with technology.
There's nothing you can do. So it's an ever-decreasing supply and ever-increasing demand.
What is it then about this that isn't replicable by technological processes?
We don't really know, and isn't that the magic and the beauty, in a way, how lofty that might come across. But
is it the culture that it
in
comes
a pragmatic, the pragmatic answer concerned with practical consequences, I would say that it's because of the cluster mentality that you find good Thai food, with the nucleus being David Thompson and his cohorts creating Thai food in this country, and then people started being inspired by his genius, and then now you find good Thai food or adequate Thai food in just about every suburb or small town in Australia. And it was the same cluster mentality that you got with all craftsmen and women in northern Italy, especially during the Renaissance with visual arts and so forth, and with violin building, starting in the 15th century and peaking around the time of the end of the Baroque period in 1750.
Just before we went on, you and I got talking in the dressing room there about the idea that music is a therapeutic thing. Music is therapy. It's a healing thing. It ought to be healing. I have very strong feelings about that, and I know you do as well. I think they're quite similar. Tell me what you think of that idea, Richard.
Well, look, the Taliban certainly don't agree with that, and in fact, they had a search and destroy mission. They got musical instruments at cassette players and musicians and burned them in public pyres, attributing their sentiments to the Prophet Muhammad, warning those who listen to music and songs in this world, on the day of judgment, molten lead will be poured into their ears. And then, of course, we know what the Nazis tried to do, control music. We know what the Soviets tried to do, control music. And this is born of a notion of utopia, that we'll create some kind of utopia if we have music, if we don't have music, or if we control it in a particular way. My attitude to the transformational power, the healing powers of music, is that it's the other side of the coin, that you're trying to control music in order to heal, in the same way that these psychopaths trying to control music in order to create a utopian society by removing it.
So music must necessarily be dangerous then?
Well, not necessarily. It just can be used in a dangerous way. I just think that, sorry to be lofty again, but it's to quote, Oscar Wilde, all art is useless. And it should just be left alone. As Kevin Rudd learnt, I hope he learnt, only too well when he started associating some kind of moral imperative on little photos that he was showing with black bands over so-called naked parts on a commercial channel, early morning TV, and he brought in moral imperative, and it came to bite him. I mean, and I know it was highly controversial, but it's art is a very difficult thing to impose a moral imperative upon.
Yes.
And so if you say it's therapeutic, then on the other hand, you have to say it's dangerous and causes harm.
Yeah, the flip side of that thing about art being necessarily useless is that when it becomes useful, it always becomes kitsch, doesn't it? It becomes employed by someone for other purposes and therefore becomes kitsch and vulgar.
And then you could argue it's not music anymore.
Yeah.
They're sounds and utilitarian
It's propaganda, yeah. Another project you've been working on has been called The Crowd, and I think you're bringing that to Australia, aren't you?
We've just done
You've
it,
just done
yeah.
it, I beg your pardon. That's right, it was last month, wasn't it? Tell me a bit about the ideas behind this project, The Crowd, why you were thinking of crowds.
Well, I've been intrigued by the notion of opera for many years, and often I go to the opera, like possibly many of you here, or many of you here don't go to the opera, for the same reasons that I go to the opera and then don't go to the opera, and that is that it's often confounding, appears to be elitist, and you know, you can't really work out what the story is about, and then when you do read what the story is about, you wish you hadn't, and you know, you wait and wait and wait, and then you hear a good bit of music, and you think, well, okay, that was a long wait, and I can't wait to get to the pub, but then you have this epiphany, you know, and it happened to me in a Richard Strauss opera. I thought, oh, here we go, it's going to go for hours. And right from the first note, it was like an electric charge. It was called Die Frau ohne Schatten. And it changed me completely. And that's why I don't go to the opera, in case I won't have that Pentecostal experience. So I listened to it. But I thought, well, look, you know, it's a strange media, this idea of, and it's such a cross-cultural, cross-media platform opera. And so I thought, well, what if we started looking at it, you know, what you do in a visual way has such a strong impact on your ears. So what I say is that what you see, you hear more, you see more with your ears in something like this. So we started...
You see more with your ears.
Yes, so we started looking at audio-visual with a screen, because of course it's much cheaper to have a screen than it is to have you know, opera. Don't tell the funding bodies this, because I'd want the opera company to keep on going. But so we've started these, cross.
So this is the SEO performing.
I call them cross-pollination.
Yeah.
So you have a screen, you have an orchestra in front, and you play with people's minds.
Crowds in particular, though. Why crowds?
At first, it was surfing and waves, which is very hypnotic and apolitical to an extent. And then we looked at the crowds and what people do and how they do it, and it became very political and socio-political and overwhelming, provocative, daunting, and we had a deadline.
Tell me how your thinking on crowds has shifted, though, because
Yes,
crowds
so
make you nervy, don't they?
Well, I think crowds make a lot of people nervy. I mean, I was almost crushed, not to death, but could have been, at the only time I went to the Mardi Gras, and I was caught just in front of the barricades, and the police were pushing us back, and the crowd was pushing from behind, and it was a terrifying experience. I had a bit of agoraphobia. It was probably quite normal, and I never went into a big crowd situation subsequent to that. And so I always thought, oh, you know, going to a football match, football hooligans, you know, play the word association test. So I started reading Crowds and Power by Elias Canetti and had the same kind of feeling, oh yeah, crowds are sort of malevolent force. And you know, and Nietzsche certainly has this in mind, you know, that it's a sort of madness in individual as an exception, but in the crowd it's a rule. And you know, and you'd see crowds on TV in some, you know, unlikely country, you know, improbable country. You wouldn't travel to a country, you know, with crowds sort of running amok, and so you sort of protect yourself. But then I started reading this book by James Surowiecki, The Wisdom of the Crowds, and this changed my tune completely, because what I realized is that actually crowds are democracy, and crowds are republics, and crowds are positive protests, and crowds are football matches. And 99.999% of the time, there's an incredible piece that is at a football match. Crowds are heavy metal concerts where you have this oneness with something that's meant to be sort of in touch with the devil. And so reading this book changed my tune completely. And so from it being a malevolent force, I realized that the power of the crowd, the wisdom of the crowd, was something that was munificent and something to be really worshipped. And so this was reflected in the way the footage was shot, and it was a kind of celebration. And the way that I'm amazed, as Louis C.K. says, the great comedian, he said he's amazed that, he's not shocked when he hears that, people were crushed at a football match. 2 people, he thinks, well, why weren't all of them crushed? and you realize that the wisdom of the crowd works better than the expertise of the individual.
That's why democracy is the least worst form of government,
as John Howard, and John Howard, put it for the anti-monarchy movement, but or the pro-monarchy movement, I mean. But the interesting thing is that an orchestra, of course, is that ultimate crowd. And why do we all work as one like that, with this invisible, strange person at the front, doing that, and we all make the air resonate so that it titillates your ear. And as some people have said, including St. Augustine, confessed that as a result of his sensuous enjoyment of the melodies he heard in the church, he's become a problem to himself. And he said that on more occasions there's titillation between the legs than a sense of devotion in the brain.
St. Augustine said that, did he? Let's talk about nothing now. Nothing. I want to talk about nothing with you because you've done a whole project about nothing. What was the idea behind doing a musical event with nothing?
Well, it was the economic circumstances that were facing Slovenia, especially in 2009, after the GFC had hit, and they're still reeling. We thought that we were going into the great economic void, and it seems that we haven't at all. So I wanted to do the Magic Flute with Michael Lunig, but we didn't have the money. So I was speaking with the producer of the festival at the time, a wonderful lady called Brigitte Pavlic, and she said, well, what are we going to do? And I said, well, could we do a reduced Magic Flute? Oh, no, we can't do that. So she said, you've got 2 days to come up with an idea. So I rang her back. This was on the Friday. I rang her back on the Sunday. I said, okay, I've come up with the idea. She said, what is it? I said, it's nothing. And she said, oh, well, look, you've got 1 more day. And I said, no, that's the project. Nothing. An exploration of nothing. Now, one of the most famous works written by a musical composer, so somebody who's meant to be making sounds and delivering them to you, dear listener, is called 4 minutes 33, which you'll probably know, which is an exploration of silence by the great musical philosopher, let's call him a composer, John Cage. So that had to be the centerpiece.
This is just a guy, he shows up at the piano and sits
piano,
down.
This piece of music, sits down and plays nothing.
Nothing.
For 4 minutes 33. And what happens, and if we just do an excerpt of nothing, it's not silent, as you hear. There are people moving, and you start going into yourself. So that was the epicenter of nothing. Then we had all sorts of things. Luckily, Barry Humphries was meant to just be a guest, and the great Dadaist, I don't know if you're aware of his name, Barry Humphries, the great Dadaist, agreed to perform some nothing Dada verse by Sitwell, William Walton's Facade, which is just wonderful sort of, nothing music. That was the lighter end. Then our cinematographer took himself to India and filmed people staring into the void, as in people, in palliative care. I wouldn't call it care, where it seems they were dying, but stared right with the camera, with their permission, into their eyes, staring into the void. And
what effect did this have on the audience?
You could say discombobulating would be a kind word. It was so confronting that one of our patrons stood up and started hurling abuse at, an imaginary me in the audience, and other people were yelling back. And afterwards, I'm really speaking out of school here, but this is a Masonic lodge and it's highly confidential. Barry Humphrey's wife, who thought it was just going to be like Walton's facade of kind of nonsense verse, came screaming at me afterwards.
Screaming what?
You've abused the audience. And I said, well, the contract I had with the audience, didn't say that I wouldn't abuse them. And what did you expect with nothing? I mean, we had an astronaut just floating in the void. And what is the void? Is there nothing out there? Of course, there's something out there. But the closer you get to nothing, the further you look. You know what it's like. Anyway, but she was aghast because of we had bodies burning on pyres. We had vast tracts of sailing close to nothing, as in silence. We had an incredible 9 Inch Nails song, Natural Born Killers, which is nihilism. We had an exploration of this. We had.
Well, let me ask you a question then. If they thought if this rage and this hostility was about how crap it was, what you were doing, why did they just roll their eyes and walk out? Why shake their fist and shout?
Because they were confronted by it. Interestingly, those who were closer to dying than normally, people in a normal state of, being close to dying, like
we all are.
If you know what I mean.
Yeah.
Those closer to that state loved it and embraced it and said, wow, this was really facing, this is exactly what I'm facing.
So you touched on a raw nerve there, fear of the void.
Well, we all have a fear of the void.
Yeah. I'm just interested that rage.
But trying
response.
to do it with, how do you do it with music? Do you play it in A minor or, and...
Are you going to do it here?
No.
Why not? Oh, go on.
Well, no are the first two letters in nothing. Well, if you produce it, come on, make a comeback. Doug Anthony at All Stars doing nothing.
I love outrage on stage. I mean, this is what Stravinsky's Rites of Spring was greeted by. Shouts and anger and fist shaking and arguments. This is surely a healthy, really good thing for art to do, to provoke like that. Aren't you proud of it? You ought to be.
It's beyond being proud. It's something we did. I mean, I walked away in a state of shock. I mean, it was an amazing, if Peter Sellers, the director, and Peter Sellers, the comedian, and Barry Kosky had all colluded to try and direct nothing, it still wouldn't have come across anything like it was on the night. The choir disappeared at one point and went into the void. And then Barry Humphries made a wrong entrance, so you saw his body walk onto stage. He was pulled back by the stage manager. We had this tape that was playing, the audio tape stopped. I had to walk onto stage where we had this incredible picture of a wave, and it looked like it was just looping itself. It's a Bohr wave, funnily enough, called a bono in Indonesia. And it plays with your mind so much that you think you're hallucinating. And the visual was working, but not the audio. And so I had to walk on stage and say to the audience, and luckily I had enough spirit to do this. And I said, look, you probably think that this is deliberate. Well, you could be wrong. This is the ultimate nothing experience when everything is failing and you don't know if it's, meant to happen or not. And then at that moment, the audio chocked in and we had this TV reverend, screaming at the top of his voice, claiming to cure people with AIDS if you phone this number and send $10 or something in a...
Well, it's my idea of a top night out. I don't care what they say. Richard, just a couple of years ago, I interviewed Ira Glass, the presenter of a radio program called This American Life. Are some people familiar with this program here? And we were talking about the beauty of silence in an interview, because a lot of people in radio fear it. It's called dead air. But it's a really hard discipline to have in an interview when to keep your mouth shut as an interviewer. When
Well, Alan
someone's
Jones,
reaching
you
for
see,
something.
never ever
Never
has
does that, does he? No.
Never. He never has dead silence. No.
We both agree that silence was one of the most beautiful things you could, quote unquote, hear. What do you think of that?
Absolutely, but it depends on how you contextualize it. So it's what you have either side of the silence.
That's right. I'm going to invite you to play some music now because you have brought this beautiful instrument.
I have.
Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Richard Tognetti. Here to play.
So look, as it's too early to play whole works and we don't have the time, I'm going to play some excerpts from Fritz Kreisler wrote a beautiful song called Liebeslied, Love Sorrow. He was an apostate Jew. I think that informs us of the kind of attitude to Jews in Vienna at the time of his life. And then afterwards I'm going to play an excerpt from the Kaddish.